So hi everybody again. I'm David Breahna. I'm an administrator here at GovPredict in Chisinau, Moldova. And oh man, I'm so excited to be here today. So a little bit about myself. I joined GovPredict about 5 years ago as a Python developer, but that didn't last for more than a week or so. And because I moved to Ruby and thus Rails, and some of years later, it was the time to move on from standard Rails views and HAML templates and all of that stuff and move to some real world front end. And I also started writing React code. I've got a little bit nervous. Cheers. Then once the company grew in size, I was also assigned to a team and I became a team leader. And now I've got an executive role here in Chisinau at GovPredict. And today, GovPredict is one of the general sponsors of such a great event, Ruby Wine, that gathered a lot of Ruby enthusiasts today, and from Moldova, and from across the whole world, I guess, and I really hope so. When I started Ruby and Rails, I've heard a lot of Ruby's dead. Rails is dead. Oh man, yeah. But now I see like around 1,000 people here, Ruby developers, and it's still damn alive, isn't it?
Oh, it definitely is.
So you guys ready to get dry?
I think we are. What about you? Why don't you write in the chat or you complete the poll?
So ready to get dry, DryerB. That's going to be definitely about DryerB. Basically, I'm going to talk about a collection of Ruby libraries called DryerB. I really hope you've heard about them, or some of you even used. Some of the speakers today mentioned a lot of them, and some of the good parts and bad. Anyway, we're talking about a collection of we're talking about a collection of next generation Ruby libraries. The main goal is to help you to write clear, flexible, and more maintainable Ruby code. Enough about that, we need to hit the story. So the story, imagine yourself being a 20 years old developer, let's say Ruby on Rails engineer. You just got hired by a really cool company and got started with some awesome project. The company runs 2-week sprints. It does Agile, Scrum. You do backlog grooming meetings, a lot of that stuff, which sounds awesome, even amazing, or maybe not. So every 2 weeks, you meet with your product manager, you discuss the work that needs to be done, and you do the work. And then again, you're asked to add a feature and you do that. You're asked to add something else and you do that again. And you've also got deadlines, right? Who doesn't get deadlines? It's about product development. It's about IT. The deadlines are unavoidable. And the real problem and the real issue here is that you love that. You love Rails. You love how it works. You love how quickly you can bootstrap all these things and requests. Admit it, you just love, you adore how Rails works, how things combine together in such a quick way help you to build such an amazing product, or maybe not. Again, 5 years ago when I searched for the first tutorials to learn Ruby, Rails, and all that stuff, I've Googled for a 15-minute blog, and today I've done that again, and I saw this. Here you go, Rails. And there are people who still teach that, you know, people who learn all of this and build gigantic project based on that. Remember the product manager we mentioned before? he comes to you every 2 weeks and asks you to add something. So that's your user model the first week. You're just getting started with the project, right? Here's your user model 3 weeks later. Oh yeah, damn a lot. Imagine this user model 3 months later. Little did you know you'll end up in hell, right? You can notice here line 600, your validation callbacks just start, and line 700, your validation callbacks end. Oh yeah, that's the hell we're talking about, the callback hell, the helpers hell. I'm sure you've heard about that. Nested attributes, concerns, and a lot of more stuff that is regularly taught by a lot of professionals. Here are some real stats about GovPredict main project, a web application. And these stats are from our code base. We have around 300 models. 300, yep.
Sorry for interrupting. I was wondering if your slides are supposed to be moving, because currently we only see, okay, yeah, now they have moved. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, but did you see my previous slides?
We only have seen the part where there was the question, I think, with the ready to get dry.
Okay, okay, I guess, okay. I'll just go back. Okay, I guess I missed some slides. I don't know why. It happened also at the opening session. Hope you now see my screen with Rails, building 15 minutes blog.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, thanks. So 5 years ago, I Googled for Rails, and now I did that again. And as you see, we're Rails on Google, 15 minutes blog. Everybody teaches that. I'll just quickly go. Here is our user model. The first week, 3 weeks later. Okay. And the hell we end up 3 months later with callback starting at line 600 and ending at line 700. And some code-based stats from GovPredict, our main product, a web application with 300 models, 350 controllers, 500 views, and thankfully 7,000 files of tests. Thanks God. Does anybody know who George Catlin is? I'm sure not a lot of people. George Catlin is a painter, and he predicted something 200 years ago. These are Ruby on Rails developer running away from your project when you end up in this state I've just mentioned before. All of these callback hells, concerns, accept attributes, and all that stuff. So why Rails? Rails, because you love it. You love how quickly you can get started and bootstrap your project, hugely grow your startup and revenue, and deliver client requested features in like a night, an hour, or even faster. From the beginning, Rails helps you save your time, literally, because what required you to write a lot of more code, a lot of more classes, object repositories, has suddenly become one single line of code. Everybody knows that active record, save stuff, or create. That's just one line of code with a lot of complexity behind that we're using daily. But there is a limit all of us need to understand and work towards avoiding it. So imagine taking all of the developers from today's conference, 100 people, and putting them in a Rails code base in that old plain MVC and ask them to implement your request. That's just going to be a nightmare. Everybody's going to step on each other's feet, and you'll just not be able to grow your project. What we need to do is we need to decouple all the logic, to move away the code from controllers and models, and to avoid all of that we've talked previously. And thus, let's get dry. So DryerB. Why DryerB, would you ask? DryerB because it hides a lot of functional programming concepts behind, and I'm really into functional programming and I love that. You may ask yourself, does Ruby allow you to do that? Of course it does, even though we've heard that it's only an object-oriented language. It is, but not only. And there are a few things that we need to keep in mind if we want to write our classes in a functional way. That's immutability that makes our app much simpler to work with by avoiding mutating the state. That also avoiding side effects in your application whenever that is possible, and I know it's not always like that. And to satisfy all these criteria, we need to get started to write more functional objects and make them simple, much more simpler than they are right now. A functional object in Ruby is a class which has a call method, and that's the only interface it has. It's like really similar to procs and lambdas. It accepts an input and returns an output, and it doesn't mutate the object state, and it shouldn't mutate the input's data either. Also, a lot of production-ready tools and frameworks are based on DryerB, or have the same concepts or share the same idea and aims. That's RomerB, Rhoda, Hanami, Trailblazer. I'm sure you've heard about a lot of them. As I mentioned before, DryerB is a collection of libraries. As you can see here, 22 gems, by this time written in Ruby. Each of them solve one specific problem. So you can only pick one of them, and it is definitely worth a shot. They are written in a way that you can add them to your project and they shouldn't mess anything up in your code. And it is also continuously maintained and continuously growing. The latest release is from March 11 this year, like basically 1 month ago, by Piotr Solnitsa. I'm sure a lot of you heard about him, if not about him as a creator, then about his previous product, gem or tool, that's Virtus Model. Virtus Model is an plain old Ruby object, and just like documentation says, with attributes on steroids. You include the model, you declare attributes with coercion to types and with default values. But even its creator, Piotr Solnitsa, left the project, and basically he abandoned it because it started to become really complex, and it started to inherit a lot of ideas and legacy from active type of thing and from Rails. And he really wanted to decouple all of these things, and thus he created dry types, dry struct, and dry schema. As you already noticed, or maybe not, Piotr Solnitsa is one of the core developers of DryerB. So next slide. Functional objects. You literally can call them whatever you want, and I've heard a lot of people calling them in many different ways, from services, forms, actions, to commands and interactors. I love thinking about them as verbs because they try to look like functions. And what do functions do? They perform an action. And thus, an action is a verb, and not a saver, a validator, a creator, or a bulk updater. We even sometimes struggle with defining the exact word that could describe our action. Here is our first attempt to get rid of all the validation callbacks and all the health concerns in our models and move away all that code. And we'll start that by writing actions, really small, which only do one thing. Here is a create user action. It receives params and it's saved an user. What we've got here, not much, because it does nothing, literally. And that's what you would say, right? And writing action like this, actually, if you do that for all of your models and all of your callbacks, then you can move all your callbacks here in actions. Instead of having a callback when a user is saved and send an email, you move it here to the action. There is still one thing that we missed, and that is validation. It was still in the model in the previous slide. Here, the validation is still in the model, and anybody can just skip the validation when they save the user. To avoid that, we're going to add a form, which is going to validate our parameters or data before saving the user. Here we define all call matter for our action. We validate the form, assign attributes to user from form and save the user, check if user is admin and send an email. Oh, my slides didn't move again, right? And here we're initializing the form and sending it to the create user action. What's the first thing you'd have in mind when it comes to form? That's probably plain old Ruby objects, as we talked, and most of all, I think, active model validation, right? And that is bad. As mentioned today, it is really slow. It still brings you that active thing, and callbacks, they're still there. So dry validation, already mentioned today, it is strict explicit schemas or contract objects. I love to call them contract objects because people used to call forms objects that not only validate the data, but also perform some actions like saving or updating that record. So I'm just going to call them contracts today. So what does dry validation do? It sanitizes the input data. It can perform some coercion and also type checking. It is a real alternative to huge model validation and to all of the active record stuff that we're used to write in the model. And also it helps us to avoid strong params at all. You just don't need to have strong parameters anymore in your controller. Let's look at an example of how that contract looks like. So basically what you see here is at the top, you declare a block params with your attribute keys, with your input keys, an email which needs to be filled and is required, and also age, which needs to be integer. Then you can define rules based on that. Rules are going to be called right after the input past the params block. Oops. Yeah. So dry schema, there are 3 types of schemas you can use: schema, params, and JSON. They basically work in the same way with slight differences and more or less severity performing validation. We're going to check the difference between first 2 of them, and that's schema and params. So schema basically accept inputs as symbol keys, and params accept params as they come from front end, and you're used to use them in your application. That's string keys, and they also perform coercion from, you can see here when the age is the type string, it coerces to integer. Yeah, so basically the only difference between schema and params is the way they perform coercion and the type of inputs they accept, either the symbol keys or string keys. One really cool thing about dry validation is also reusing schemas. So basically you could declare atomic parts of your validation logic. You could have an address schema, contact schema, address schema, contract, and then use both of them together in new user contract to combine both of them together, obviously. So coming back to our create user action, our product manager comes to us and asks us to add something new to the code that already was there. Like, hey, please send a mobile notification when we save that user. In your typical Rails project, you would add that as a callback method, right? But now that we have an action here, we can add it here. And we already did so for send email. Now imagine that you don't only need to send a notification, but also capture analytics or do a lot of other things. You can imagine that you're basically just moved all the code from models to this single action, and you didn't solve a lot of things because all of it is still here, and it's really coupled and hard to work with. Yep, the same code, and here we have the callbacks that we just moved from the user model. Here comes dry transaction. It provides a simple way to define complex business transaction that includes processing over many steps that you define in your class object. And it also uses concern railway-oriented programming. I'm sure you've heard about that. It's basically this. So at each step, you either have to choose if you're going to go the right way or to the left, if it's going to be a success or a failure. To see that in action, here we go. This is a dry transaction. That's a class where you define the steps, which are going to be called step by step, one by one, from top to the bottom. And at any step, you could either return a failure or a success. These are basically containers or wrappers, monads, but I'm not going to go into all the theory about monads because at the time we have is not going to be enough. So at the end, we're able to call these transactions in our controller in this way, which is pretty typical. You check if the result is success, you render something, and if it's not, then you render unprocessable entity. But also you're able to call your transaction in this way. So basically, you have blocks of codes, and the first one is success. This one is only called when all of your steps succeeded, and the last step of your transaction returns success. On the second step, we try to capture the failure only from the validate method. And in this way, we could show a customer message only for this step. And this is a generic failure, which is going to be interpreted at the end. I need to mention the step adapters because they're a really big part of the dry transaction. So basically, dry transaction has 4 types. The step you already know, we used it, and it also has try, map, and T. We really used a lot of T because a lot of step and T. Because T is really cool when you want to send a notification, but you don't want to revert the action or to return a failure, because your user doesn't really need to know that he failed to save a record, right? He didn't actually fail to save a record. He doesn't need to know about that. That's you as a programmer who needs to worry about that your notification wasn't sent. So for the map step adapter, any output is considered successful and it returns a success. So the last line of your output is success. The check operation, the try operation may raise an exception. That's why we are providing there a catch key, which could catch that validation error and wrap it in a failure monad. So, okay. Here, we're going back to our create user action. And if we think about if you want to include a dependency injection in the action that we created previously, and there are a lot of services and objects we want to include and provide in our constructor, you can see that this really grows a lot in size. And to avoid that, dry initializer comes to our help. I'm sorry, I'm running out of water, so I'm going to be I'm going to drink a little bit of wine.
It's supposed to be like that, probably. That's why your presentation it's about getting dry.
Correct. So basically, at the left side of your screen, you could see that you have to manually manage all the dependencies. Instead, at the right, you're able to declare the params that you want to receive, and you don't have to write that manually in your constructor. Also, there are a lot of cool things with dry initializer that you could do. That's dry types, but that's optional. It's up to you, really. That's dry types where you can handle the types of your input. You could define your own types, and that's pretty much it about dry initializer. Here you extend it and declare the params you want to receive. And also, I really want to mention containers. And I'm not going to talk about Docker containers today. Instead, I'm going to talk about IOC containers. And that these are will be implemented today with dry container. The IOC container, so dry container is basically a thread safe container intended to be your first step to a dependency injection system. It basically helps you automate the process of injecting the dependencies to your services so that you don't do that manually every time, like in your controller or in your workers or whatever you're calling your service. So everywhere you would put them, let's check the next slide. That's how you declare a container. Let's call it global container. You have to extend the dry container mixin, and then you're registering your service. You could register it globally, or you could put it in a namespace like services, create user. And then you see on line 9, we're referencing to self forms, which is the namespace registered below, forms create user form. That's really handy when it comes to calling that service. As you can see below in the controller, I can reference to my service to global container. and call my service. And I don't have to manually initialize and pass all the dependencies to that service. That's probably the main benefit of the container. Yeah, let's recap a little bit about what I've covered today. There's dry validation that helps you move all the validation logic from your models to your contracts, forms, or however you call them. That's dry transaction that helps you combine and compose multiple actions together instead of having a callback chain of services. You end up with a transaction which is built around steps. Also, dry initializer that helps you avoid writing manually all the constructor attributes, and dry container that helps you with dependency injection and define all of this automatically. Why would I choose DryerB? Would be your question, obviously. Well, first of all, it really brings you simplicity to your code that you're writing. Why do you need this, right? That's a good question, even for me, even now. First of all, I love it, but that's not an argument, right? So if you try to build your app and you do that around using small components with a single focus, you combine the object-oriented programming and principles with functional concepts of data, the way data flows in your project and in your code. This makes the components in your app really small, really easy to combine, easy to understand at a later point in time of your project, then easy to reuse and test. That's really maintainable and sustainable, and it's easy to work and understand the architecture of your code at day 1000 as easy as a day at your first day in that project, because you know where that code belongs to. It's not in the model at line 1000 anymore, right? That's pretty much it about my talk today. Once again, thanks GovPredict for giving me the opportunity to come up in front of you with a speech today about the technologies and libraries we use internally at GovPredict to build a better software, to do that faster and in a more interesting way, at least for us. And also a big thanks to Ruby Wine and to Ruby Wine organizers for not giving up on this event and for gathering us today in front of our computers.
Yeah.
Once again, I'm from GovPredict and we're hiring all level of engineers. Feel free to check out govpredict.com, our careers page. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, David, very much. And yeah, we would like to also show our gratitude towards you having this presentation with us, and also towards GovPredict being our sponsor for this event as well. Now, I think it's time to also move to the Q&A and see what questions are there. Can you open this section and read the questions out loud?
Yep, I'm trying. Do I need to stop sharing my screen to do that?
Not necessarily.
Unfortunately, I had to stop because I didn't see the questions.
Okay. Why not visible?
Yep, so the first one. What's about Trailblazer? Did you try it? And what is your feedback on it? Do you prefer Hanami or Trails or strict DryerB? So first of all, we didn't try it in our current project and in our main products at GovPredict. I took a look at Trailblazer. I tried it in some pet projects. It is really cool and it shares a lot of common ideas. The main thing about it is we weren't able to use it in our application because we felt like if we include Trailblazer, we have to use everything it provides. With DryerB, we were free to choose one library, include it, and use it. And we first started that with dry validation. And now we're adding more and more gems from DryerB. But obviously, Trailblazer was one of the first thing we looked at because it's much more popular, right? I'm not sure if I answered your question, but at least I tried. I'll read the second one. Thanks for your presentation. We both have spoken about validations, and I have to ask, 6 months ago, I've tried to retrieve the metadata from the dry schemas. And now I know new release added info method for the dry schema that performs it. But even with it, it gives much less info than was provided to a schema. It is now possible to reach the insights of schema. Yes, I'm wondering about docs generation. Good question. I haven't tried that. At the moment, I was preparing for today's talk. I mean, even a few hours ago today, I was wondering it would be really cool if I'll be able to try to do schema-driven development using dry validation or dry schema. And then I saw your talk, and I was, oh, that guy did that before me. So you'll just have to check it out. What is the decision framework for choosing existing tool that offers some common patterns and building your own tool with the patterns that you really need? Oops, sorry. Is someone clicking? What is one disadvantage or thing you had to fight with DryerB? Okay, so with DryerB, we had really one issue, and that's with dry transaction. At the time we first used it, it was pretty hard to manage active record transactions because we were still using active record within our service. And it was pretty complicated to build separate steps, but that could revert the dry transaction. Now, DryerB introduced containers, and dry transaction can include a container that you declare by yourself, and that container could provide the logic to revert the steps based on the active record when you want to abort a transaction, right? And now that is really, we haven't give it a try yet, but we're definitely looking forward to do so. That's from our side, but I'm really wondering what was that in your case, if you had to fight against something with DryerB, if you tried it.
I also want to remind our participants that in case they have a question, they can also raise their hands, and we can also allow them to speak up and involve in a discussion with the speaker. So we can continue now with the questions.
So, okay, say missed one. What is the decision framework for choosing existing tool that offers some common patterns and building your own tool with the patterns that you really need? Is that question for me? Okay, that was pretty cool. First of all, I don't think internally we have a lot of time to rebuild dry validation, let's say, or dry transaction, because we didn't want to spend time in writing the code that we could use. And at first glance, when we looked at DryerB, it is a really clean code that you could understand. Obviously not really easy because there are some concepts that you need to understand first of all behind it. That's basically it. We didn't want to write that on our own. What steps do you take when you transfer simple Rails API SAS application with a lot of code and relations to DryerB, trail schema of development. What steps? So first of all, I really hope you have tests for your API endpoints. Otherwise, it really doesn't make sense to do so. If you don't have them, please write. I'm sure you have. The second one would be to implement the forms and to validate the data that comes to your controller when it is called. Just use dry validation or dry schema. That's the tool behind dry validation. And then try, it really depends on the services you're using and the actions and all the code. If it's really one action, you don't really need dry transaction, right? But if it's, if there are multiple, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, okay. I just lost the image and I thought I'm lost. And the second one is try to use the forms and the services together. You don't really need dry transaction because it is supposed to have a lot of actions in there. If you only have one, you don't need that dry transaction, right? I really hope I answered your question.